My parents abandoned me for their dream life. So I built my own success and left them begging for help, and then I was 13 when my world fell apart. Until that point, I thought my life was normal. Sure, it wasn't perfect. Our little house on the outskirts of Toledo wasn't much to look at, and we didn't have fancy vacations like some of my classmates. But it was home, and it was enough. At least, I thought it was. That all changed one gray afternoon in October 1994. I remember the air smelled damp, like rain was coming. I was sitting on the living room floor, trying to help my little brother Ethan, who was 8 at the time, finish a school project. He kept getting distracted, humming songs from his favorite cartoon and asking me if dragons were real. "Ethan, focus," I said, trying not to lose my patience. That's when my dad, David, walked in. He was a tall man with thinning brown hair and a worn-out look that seemed permanent. My mom, Linda, followed close behind, clutching a stack of papers and wearing the same strained expression she'd had for weeks. "Maggie," Dad said, his voice heavy, "we need to talk." Something in his tone made my stomach twist. I glanced at Ethan, who had stopped humming and was now staring wide-eyed at our parents. "Okay," I said cautiously, standing up. Mom and Dad sat on the couch, leaving just enough space for me to sit between them. I stayed where I was, crossing my arms. "We've been thinking a lot about this," Mom started, her voice shaking. "And, well, things have gotten really hard for us financially. We can't take care of you anymore," Dad blurted out, cutting her off. I stared at him, unsure if I'd heard him right. "What?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not forever," Mom added quickly, "just until we can get back on our feet. We're looking at every option, Maggie, but right now—" "Wait," I interrupted, stepping back. "What do you mean you can't take care of us? What does that even mean?" Dad ran a hand down his face, looking exhausted. "We don't have a choice, sweetheart," he said. "We're struggling to pay bills and, well, we've found families that can help." "Families?" My voice cracked. "What are you talking about?" Mom looked down at her hands, unable to meet my eyes. "You'll be staying with the Callahans," she said softly. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The Callahans? They were some family I'd never even heard of. "And Ethan?" I asked, my heart racing. Dad hesitated, then said, "Ethan's going to a boarding school." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were splitting us up? My little brother, who still slept with a nightlight and cried during thunderstorms, was being sent away like he was someone else's problem? "This doesn't make sense," I said, my voice rising. "You can't just get rid of us." "We're not getting rid of you," Mom said, tears filling her eyes. "We're doing this for you. We can't give you what you need right now, Maggie." I didn't believe her. I didn't believe either of them. "So you're just done being our parents?" I asked. "Is that it?" Dad stood up, his frustration boiling over. "This isn't easy for us either," he snapped. "Do you think we want this? We're doing the best we can." "No, you're not," I yelled back. "You're giving up. That's what this is." Ethan started crying then, and I turned to comfort him. He clung to me, his small hands gripping my sweater like I was the only thing keeping him safe. For the next few days, I clung to the hope that they'd change their minds. But when the day came, they packed us up without so much as a second thought. Ethan was sent off first. He hugged me so tightly that I could barely breathe, his small frame shaking with sobs. "Don't forget me," he whispered as they led him away. When it was my turn, my parents drove me to the Callahans' house, a neat 2-story place on a quiet street. I remember staring at the white shutters and the freshly mowed lawn, feeling like I'd been dropped into a stranger's life. Mom gave me a half-hearted hug before leaving. "Be good," she said. Dad didn't say anything. He just nodded, got back in the car, and drove away. I stood there on the Callahans' front porch, clutching my suitcase, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. The Callahans, to their credit, were kind. They welcomed me with warm smiles and reassurances that I could treat their home as my own. But it didn't feel like home. Nothing about it felt right. Every time I walked past the kitchen table, I expected to see Ethan doodling on his homework or Mom sipping her coffee. Instead, I got polite strangers trying to fill the void left by the two people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. For weeks, I barely spoke to anyone. I couldn't focus in school, and at night, I cried into my pillow, hoping no one could hear me. The anger I felt toward my parents grew stronger every day. I couldn't understand how they could just let us go like that. At first, I believed their promise that it was temporary. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, I started to realize the truth. They weren't coming back for me. I wasn't their priority anymore. That realization broke something in me. The girl who used to dream about summer trips to the lake or decorating the Christmas tree with her family was gone. In her place was someone else. Someone angry, scared, and determined not to let anyone hurt her like that again. I didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of my fight to take control of my own life. The fight to prove, to myself and to the world, that I was worth more than the scraps I'd been left with. And I wasn't going to let anyone, not even them, take that away from me. When I moved in with the Callahans, I tried to adjust, but it was harder than I could have imagined. They were good people, kind, patient, and genuinely interested in making me feel welcome. But it wasn't the same. Their house, with its perfectly arranged furniture and faint smell of lavender, didn't feel like home. I kept waiting for my parents to call or write, but the days dragged on with no word. Weeks turned into months, and the silence became deafening. By the time I was 14, the hurt had morphed into anger. I stopped hoping they'd come back for me. I stopped hoping for anything from them at all. That anger kept me afloat, giving me something to focus on besides the emptiness I felt inside. It was around that time I stumbled across their profiles online. The Callahans had a computer in their office, a bulky beige thing with a loud modem that made strange noises whenever it connected to the internet. It was 1995, and I was just starting to figure out how this whole World Wide Web thing worked. At first, I only used it for schoolwork or to play the occasional game. But one day, curiosity got the better of me. I typed my dad's name into the search bar, not really expecting anything to come up. But it did. A blog popped up with their names on it, and my heart skipped a beat. It felt like I'd found some secret doorway into their lives. I clicked the link, my hands shaking. The first thing I saw was a picture of them standing on a beach. They were smiling, sunglasses perched on their noses, with the ocean glittering behind them. The caption read, "Living our best lives in the Bahamas." My stomach twisted. I clicked through more posts. There were pictures of them sipping cocktails in Paris, hiking in the Swiss Alps, and posing in front of landmarks I'd only seen in textbooks. Every caption was some variation of how free they felt, how happy they were to be exploring the world together. There wasn't a single mention of me or Ethan. I kept scrolling, hoping, desperately, for something that would explain this. Maybe they were working while traveling? Maybe these trips were somehow connected to their plan to figure things out? But the more I read, the more it became clear that wasn't the case. They weren't struggling. They weren't looking for ways to bring us back together. They were living their dream life, completely untethered from the responsibilities they'd once had. I stared at the screen, feeling like someone had punched me in the gut. My parents, the ones who'd sat me down and told me they had no choice but to send me away, were out there living it up while I was stuck in foster care, trying to piece my life back together. I clicked on their most recent post, hoping, maybe foolishly, for some acknowledgement of what they'd done. Instead, I found a picture of them standing in front of a villa with the caption, "Grateful for this amazing journey." Grateful. That word hit me like a slap in the face. Grateful for what? For abandoning their kids? For lying to us? I didn't realize I was crying until I felt the tears hit my hands. I quickly wiped them away, anger bubbling up inside me. How dare they? How could they? That night, I couldn't sleep. The images of their smiling faces haunted me, the captions replaying in my mind like a broken record. The next day, I confronted the Callahans. "Did you know?" I demanded, shoving a printout of their blog in front of them. Mr. Callahan frowned as he glanced at the page. "Know what, Maggie? That they're living like this," I said, my voice trembling with rage. Mrs. Callahan placed a hand on my shoulder. "Maggie, we didn't know," she said softly. "We were told they couldn't take care of you and Ethan because of financial issues." I shook my head, pulling away from her touch. "They lied," I spat. "They didn't care about us. They just wanted to get rid of us so they could go live their stupid fantasy." Mrs. Callahan's face crumpled, but I didn't stick around to hear whatever comforting words she was about to say. I ran up to my room, slammed the door, and collapsed onto the bed. For hours, I stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. But no matter how I looked at it, there was no justification for what they'd done. They hadn't just abandoned us, they'd erased us. That realization hurt more than anything else. Over the next few weeks, I became obsessed with their blog. I checked it every day, scrolling through new posts and old ones, trying to find some kind of explanation. But there was nothing. No guilt, no regret, no acknowledgement of the life they'd left behind. It wasn't until I came across a post about Ethan that I completely broke down. They'd mentioned him once in passing, saying they were proud of him for adjusting so well to boarding school. That was it. Just a single sentence buried in a long post about their latest trip to Italy. It was like we were footnotes in their story, barely worth mentioning. That was the moment I knew I couldn't count on them anymore. I couldn't keep waiting for them to come back. If they wanted freedom, fine. They could have it. But I wasn't going to let their choices define me. I tore down every wall I'd built around myself and threw myself into my schoolwork. The Callahans, bless them, did everything they could to support me. They helped me find tutors, encouraged me to join clubs, and showed up to every parent-teacher meeting, cheering me on like I was their own. It wasn't easy, but I started to believe I could create a future for myself, a future where I wasn't defined by the people who had left me behind. Still, the hurt lingered. No matter how hard I tried to push it down, there were nights when it bubbled back to the surface. But I told myself one thing over and over. I would never let them see me broken. They didn't deserve that. By the time I was 16, I had learned how to survive without them. The sadness, the anger, the confusion. It didn't go away entirely, but I found ways to keep it buried. My parents had chosen their path, and I was determined to carve out my own. The Callahans were a big part of that. They weren't rich or flashy like my parents used to pretend to be, but they were steady and dependable. Mr. Callahan worked as a mechanic, and Mrs. Callahan ran a small bakery from home. They didn't have much, but they made me feel like I mattered. It was Mrs. Callahan who first noticed how restless I'd become. "You need something to focus on, Maggie," she said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "Something that's just for you." I didn't respond right away. I'd been going through the motions at school, doing well enough to keep my grades up, but not really engaging with much else. "I don't know what that would even be," I finally admitted. "Start small," she said, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Find something you enjoy, and the rest will follow." I didn't think much of her advice at the time, but the next day at school, I signed up for a few clubs on a whim: debate, yearbook, and student government. I didn't expect much to come from it, but it gave me something to do after school, something that kept my mind busy. What I didn't expect was how much I'd enjoy it. In debate club, I found a way to channel my anger into something productive. It felt good to stand up and argue a point, to make people listen to me. In student government, I learned how to organize events and rally people around a cause. And in yearbook, I found a friend who would change my life. Her name was Claire Reynolds. She was one of those people who could make anyone feel at ease. She had curly blonde hair, a loud laugh, and a knack for saying exactly what you needed to hear. We clicked almost instantly. One afternoon, as we sat cross-legged on the floor of the yearbook office, sorting through photos, she looked at me and said, "You're kind of a mystery, you know that?" "What do you mean?" I asked, laughing nervously. "You're always so put together," she said, studying me. "But I get the feeling there's a lot more going on under the surface." I shrugged, not sure how to respond. Claire didn't push. Instead, she started talking about her own life, her parents' divorce, the struggle she'd had with anxiety, and how photography had become her escape. By the time she finished, I felt safe enough to share my story. I told her about my parents, about Ethan, about the blog and the lies, and how I'd ended up in foster care. I expected her to look at me differently after that, but she didn't. Instead, she just said, "That's a lot to carry. You're stronger than you realize." Claire became my anchor. She was the one I called when I felt overwhelmed, the one who sat with me in the library late at night when I needed to vent, the one who reminded me that it was okay to let people in. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. But even as things started to improve, The shadows of my past refused to disappear. One evening, while scrolling through my parents' blog, because, let's be honest, I couldn't stop checking, I came across a new post. They'd just returned from some island in the Caribbean, and the pictures were as infuriating as ever. Cocktails on the beach, sunset cruises, and captions about how much they loved their simpler life. I stared at the screen, feeling a familiar wave of anger. But what made it worse was the realization that I wasn't just angry anymore. I was hurt. Hurt that they could talk about freedom and happiness while Ethan and I had been left to fend for ourselves. Hurt that they seemed to have no regrets, no second thoughts about what they'd done. That night, I sent them an email. I poured everything I was feeling into it. The anger, the heartbreak, the betrayal. I told them how abandoned I felt, how unfair it was that they got to live their dream life while I had to start over from scratch. I hit send and waited, my heart pounding. Their reply came the next day. It was short, dismissive, and filled with the same excuses I'd heard before. "You don't understand the sacrifices we've made," they wrote. "We did what we thought was best for the family." That was the last straw. I decided then and there that I wasn't going to let them have any more power over me. If they wanted to live their lives without us, fine, but they weren't going to drag me down with them. With the Callahans' help, I started learning about things I'd never thought much about before. Saving money, setting goals, and planning for the future. I got a part-time job at a diner after school, bussing tables and saving every penny I could. By the time I turned 17, I had a small savings account and the beginnings of a plan. I wanted to go to college, to build a life that no one could take away from me. That year, I found out I'd qualified for a scholarship. It wasn't just any scholarship either. It covered nearly everything. When I told Mrs. Callahan, she hugged me so tightly I thought I might suffocate. "I'm so proud of you, Maggie," she said, tears in her eyes. "You've worked so hard for this." Hearing her say that made me realize how far I'd come. I wasn't the same scared, angry girl who had stood on their porch 3 years ago. I was someone new, someone stronger, more determined, and ready to fight for the future I deserved. And for the first time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could do this. By the time I turned 21, I was halfway through college and feeling like my life was finally on track. I was studying business at a state university in Columbus, working part-time at a local coffee shop, and mapping out a future I could actually look forward to. For years, I kept my parents at arm's length, ignoring their occasional attempts to contact me. Their blog posts had become less frequent as their glamorous lifestyle began to unravel. I didn't need to dig too deep to see the cracks forming. The excitement in their captions had dulled, and the pictures seemed more forced than ever. But as much as I tried to keep them out of my mind, they had a way of reappearing when I least expected it. It was a rainy Tuesday evening in early spring when I got an email from them. I was in my dorm room, finishing up a report for my accounting class. Seeing their names in my inbox sent a wave of dread through me. The email started innocently enough. They wrote about how proud they were of my accomplishments, how they'd heard I was doing well in school. But then, toward the end, they slipped in a line about how things had been tough lately and how they hoped I might be able to help out. Help out. I stared at the screen, trying to process the nerve it took for them to ask me for anything. For years, they'd ignored my emails, brushed off my feelings, and lived their lives like I didn't exist. And now that they were struggling, they had the audacity to turn to me? I didn't respond, but they didn't stop there. A few weeks later, I got a text from Ethan. It was the first time I'd heard from him in months. "Can we talk?" he wrote. We met up at a cafe near campus. I hadn't seen him in person since he'd graduated from boarding school, and the years apart were evident. He looked older, taller, but there was a weariness in his eyes that didn't belong on someone so young. Over coffee, Ethan told me everything. "They're back in the U.S., he said, stirring his drink absently. "They've been trying to become travel influencers, but it's not working. They burned through their savings, maxed out their credit cards." I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my emotions in check. "They're broke, Maggie," he said, his voice soft. "And they're trying to get to me because of it," I replied bitterly. Ethan nodded. "They've been contacting me too," he admitted. "Trying to guilt me into convincing you to reunite the family." I let out a hollow laugh. "Reunite?" After everything they've done? Ethan didn't argue. He just looked down at his cup. I felt a surge of protectiveness for him then. He'd been through so much. Shuffled off to boarding school, left to navigate life without any real support. The least I could do was make sure he didn't get dragged back into their chaos. You don't owe them anything, Ethan, I said firmly. Neither of us does. He nodded, but the doubt on his face was hard to miss. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about his plans. He was staying with friends while figuring out his next steps, and I offered to help him however I could. If our parents weren't going to be there for him, I would. Meanwhile, my own life was gaining momentum. The internship I'd landed during my junior year turned into a part-time paid position. It wasn't glamorous, mostly data entry and assisting with small projects, but it was a foot in the door. Balancing work and school wasn't easy, but I'd gotten used to juggling responsibilities. I'd also started a side hustle teaching financial literacy workshops to other students. It was something I'd picked up from the Callahans, who had taught me the basics of budgeting and saving when I first came to live with them. The workshops took off faster than I expected, and soon I was collaborating with local organizations and creating resources for young adults. But even as things started to look up for me, my parents weren't done stirring the pot. One evening, I got a notification on LinkedIn. It was a comment on a post I'd made about my internship. "We're so proud of you. Let's reconnect soon," the comment read. I stared at it in disbelief. I hadn't heard from them in months, and now they were trying to insert themselves into my professional life? The next day, I brought it up to my supervisor, who had become something of a mentor to me. She didn't mince words. "Block them," she said firmly. "You don't need that kind of distraction." So I did. But they didn't stop there. A few weeks later, I got a frantic call from Ethan. "They're at it again," he said. "They're telling everyone who'll listen that you've abandoned them." I sighed, feeling the weight of their manipulation all over again. "It's the same story, Ethan," I said. "Let them talk. People will see through it eventually." And people did. A family friend reached out to tell me that my parents were on the verge of bankruptcy. Apparently, they'd started selling off their belongings to make ends meet, but it wasn't enough. They were drowning in debt and still trying to maintain the illusion of their perfect life. Hearing this didn't bring me any joy. If anything, it just reinforced how much I needed to keep my boundaries. By the end of that year, I felt more secure than ever. I had a clear path forward, a growing support network, and the determination to keep building the life I deserved. But no matter how far I got from my parents, they always seemed to find a way to cast their shadow over my life. I wasn't about to let them drag me down again. I was finally in control of my story, and I intended to keep it that way. By the time I graduated college, I had officially stepped into a life I could call my own. At 22, I walked across the stage with honors, my business degree in hand, and a six-figure job lined up at a top consulting firm in Chicago. It felt surreal, like all those years of struggle had finally led to something tangible, something that proved I wasn't defined by the choices of the people who abandoned me. The Callahans and Ethan were in the crowd that day, cheering louder than anyone else. Afterward, we gathered outside for pictures, their pride radiating in every smile. But, of course, my parents couldn't resist finding a way to intrude. I spotted them at the edge of the crowd, looking out of place and uncomfortable, like they weren't sure how to approach. When I turned to face them, they seized the opportunity, cutting through the other graduates and their families like they belonged there. "Maggie," my dad said, his voice thick with emotion, "we're so proud of you." My mom stepped closer, her eyes brimming with tears. "We made mistakes, but we've always wanted the best for you." I didn't flinch. Years of practice had taught me how to keep my emotions in check. "You didn't want the best for me," I said evenly. "You wanted freedom, and you got it. So what are you doing here now?" Their faces fell, but I didn't let up. "You left me and Ethan to fend for ourselves," I continued. "You can't just show up now, act like nothing happened, and expect me to welcome you back into my life." They started to argue, but Ethan stepped forward. "She's right," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "You have no right to ruin this day for her. Or for me." It was the first time I'd ever seen him stand up to them, and I couldn't have been prouder. My parents didn't fight us. They simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd like they'd never been there at all. The rest of the day was everything I needed it to be, a celebration of how far I'd come and the people who had truly been there for me. But my parents weren't finished trying to worm their way back into my life. In the weeks that followed, they contacted old family friends and distant relatives, spreading stories about how I was an ungrateful daughter who refused to forgive them. A cousin reached out, warning me that my parents were considering suing me for financial support. At first, I thought it was an empty threat, but I consulted a lawyer just to be sure. They reassured me there was no case. Having been placed in foster care severed any legal obligations I might have had toward them. Even so, the fact that they would go to such lengths only solidified my resolve. Around that time, my side hustle teaching financial literacy had blossomed into something much bigger. I was running webinars, partnering with schools, and even speaking at events about the importance of financial independence. It was fulfilling in a way I hadn't expected. And yet, my parents still found ways to cast their shadow. They reached out to my boss, accusing me of being ungrateful and claiming that I owed them for my success. Thankfully, my boss saw through their nonsense and told me about the email with a mix of amusement and disgust. "You've built this all on your own," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Ethan, too, was finding his voice. One day, he posted publicly on social media, calling out our parents for their manipulative behavior. He shared our story, how they had abandoned us, tried to guilt us into helping them, and even threatened legal action when things didn't go their way. His post went viral. Thousands of people commented, commending his bravery and condemning our parents' actions. Seeing the support roll in was overwhelming in the best way. For so long, I'd felt like their hold on me was unshakable. But now, it was clear that people saw them for what they were. I decided it was time to address the situation myself. I made a brief statement, acknowledging the lies my parents had spread and making it clear that I had no intention of reconnecting with them. I kept it professional and to the point, then shifted my focus back to the work I was doing. That moment marked a turning point for me. My parents' attempts to tear me down had failed, and for the first time in years, I felt completely in control of my own story. At 24, I reached another major milestone. I bought my first home. It was a cozy, modern house in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. For me, it wasn't just a house. It was proof that everything I'd worked for was paying off. To celebrate, I invited the Callahans and Ethan over for a housewarming. We spent the day laughing, sharing stories, and reminiscing about how far we'd all come. But, as always, my parents couldn't stay out of it. That evening, as the party wound down, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I opened the door without thinking. There they were, disheveled, desperate, and standing on my doorstep. "Maggie," my dad said, his voice trembling. "We're homeless. We have nowhere else to go." I stared at them, too stunned to speak at first. "We just need a place to stay," my mom added. "Please." I shook my head, my resolve hardening. "You can't just show up here," I said. "After everything you've done? After all the times you've tried to drag me down? You don't get to walk into my life now and act like nothing happened." They started to argue, their voices growing louder. My neighbors began peeking out their windows, curious about the commotion. I stayed calm, but firm. "You need to leave," I said. When they refused, I had no choice but to call security. As they were escorted off the property, I felt a mix of emotions, relief, anger, and a faint sadness for what could have been. But mostly, I felt free. For years, they tried to control my narrative, to insert themselves into my successes and manipulate me with guilt. But now, they were nothing more than a shadow of my past, a reminder of where I came from, but not where I was going. With Ethan and the Callahans by my side, I knew I could keep moving forward, building a life that was entirely my own.